Wasn't in the stream. Well, hello everyone. Hello. Good afternoon. As you can see, I am joined by a very special guest today here on the Left Lens. It's been a while since I've done an afternoon stream, but you all know what to do. Please do like this stream. Make sure you're liking it. Make sure you're subscribing to this channel, hitting that notifications bell, and of course, supporting this work in all the ways that are available in the description of this stream. So without further ado, though, I want to introduce our guest today. She has been on this program before. It's Professor Radhika Desai. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, but I can just say that you're a professor at the University of Manitoba, Canada, a convener of the International Manifesto group, which everyone should check out. And today we're going to be talking about your latest book, Professor Desai. We're going to be talking about capitalism, coronavirus, and war, a geopolitical economy, which is available open access. You can find that link in the description. And I just want to make a plug that this was made available open access by Knowledge Unlatched, in part of this open access movement, where this foundation was able to choose this book to make it open access. But Radhika, thanks so much for coming on once again to the Left Lens. How are you?
Very well and great to be here, Danny.
Great. Well, let's begin. I wanted to ask because I've been seeing reports in the Western mainstream media, the corporate media, talking about this energy crisis. And I remember in the beginning of the sanctions campaign against Russia over the Ukraine conflict, there was a lot made about, and there was a lot of different alarms being sounded, both in the EU and, of course, through its many critics, that these sanctions would backfire. And indeed, I believe they have. However, recent reports indicate, Bloomberg yesterday reported, that actually this energy crisis has not been as destabilizing as originally predicted, and that actually the EU still has plenty of stockpiles, plenty of reserves, and that it's been a relatively mild winter. I wanted to get your take on this energy crisis and what your book about geopolitical economy, about war and capitalism, and of course, COVID definitely has something to do with it too. But could you talk about what is underneath, I think, this conversation about the energy crisis in your estimation?
Well, that's a interesting set of points you started with, Danny. So, first of all, yes, it's been a very mild winter. So, just as you had all those heat waves earlier in Europe in the summer, now you are seeing that the winter has been extremely mild. So, this climate sort of Russian roulette sort of continues. And as a consequence, of course, the demand for energy has been lower. But that is not all. There are a couple of other points to put into this mix. So the second thing is that while at the moment the energy crisis does not seem to be biting, and European countries are boasting that their storage, their storage energy storages are full, and therefore they do not anticipate any big crisis this immediately. The fact of the matter is they've just kicked the can down the road, because what is now being predicted is that, and now expected, is that come next winter it's going to be much harder, because by then they will have exhausted what they have stored up. And what's more, they will be the fix that they are in which if they give up their access to Russian energy, then they become reliant on US energy, which has two very important effects. Number one, it is several times more costly than than Russian energy. Secondly, its climate footprint is actually many times more. I remember reading that it was about 7 to 10 times more, because you have to, you schlep the LNG all the way across the Atlantic, and you have to pressurize it and store it and all that. Whereas Russian gas was simply piped. It was just pipe gas. So that makes a big difference. But underlying this is that, and so many people may think that, since the energy crisis has not materialized, since the people of Europe are not out on the street protesting the high cost of energy, etc., which they don't seem to be, although inflation is biting them, energy costs are biting them, but somehow the hit seems to be less than expected. So this is not happening. But does that mean that the Biden administration has achieved its goal of uniting Europe under the leadership of the United States, and what's more, subordinating Europe to itself, because that's kind of what the Biden administration's goal is. And I would say the answer is no. And this is where what my book has to say also comes in, because one of the things that my book has emphasized is that the history of capitalism is not understood through lenses like globalization, in which no state matters, or US hegemony or empire, in which only the US state matters and everybody, and in each case, the world economy becomes a seamless whole in which states don't matter. The fact of the matter is that throughout the post Second World War period, states have mattered. And the idea that the United States has successfully hegemonized the world, and within that world, successfully hegemonized both Japan and Western Europe under its leadership, this can be questioned. There have always been deep divides. And one of the other things that Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War does, as did my previous book, Geopolitical Economy, is it emphasizes the extent to which the leading neoliberal financialized economies, that is the US and the UK, have very different economic structures from other leading capitalist economies. And I will name two in particular to keep things simple, namely Germany and Japan. So the point is, and historically, Europe, compared to these countries, Europe generally, with Germany and France at their core, have always retained a very, very substantial industrial capacity. Yes, they have gone down the neoliberal road, but they have not sacrificed the industry at the altar of finance, which is what the UK and the US have done. So now, what we are witnessing in the present context, the Ukraine war is many things, and I'd like to come back to that. But one of the things it is actually a war, a US led war on European industry, on Europe as a successful industrial powerhouse. Because by cutting off its energy supplies, Russian energy supplies, forcing it to do so by imposing these sanctions, using the machinery of the European Union against European member states, such as Germany itself, which is why you see, Ursula von der Leyen saying one thing and Olaf Scholz saying another thing, let alone Angela Merkel. And I'd like to come back to Angela Merkel as well. Anyway, what we are now seeing in the discussion is that European industrial leaders are very worried about European industry, because it is being squeezed from at least two sides. Number one, the cutoff of Russian energy, cheap Russian energy, and number two, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which they clearly see as anti-competitive, as essentially constituting unfair competition, giving subsidies to leading green technology leaders, and so on and so forth. So all of this is going to impact Europe, and if we do not see, either this winter or next, a big popular explosion having to do with oil prices and so on, you may very well see a business people's explosion, saying, we cannot have this, we cannot. It may not appear like that. Remember also that from everything we can tell, the people who blew up Nord Stream were certainly associated with the UK and the US. So this was another way of essentially creating a fait accompli for the Europeans. So anyway, so now we are seeing a war on European industry, and this may prove to be a sore point. Are European industrial leaders really willing to undermine their own industry, be complicit in that? And you can see that, companies like BASF, which has, for a century and a half been based in Germany, in Ludwigshafen, is now going to permanently relocate to China because China has cheaper energy. If this sort of thing continues, and BASF is a big industrial giant, on top of that, little industries in the smaller European countries are also shutting shop or relocating, and so on. And so you can see the writing on the wall. What are the Europeans going to do? This will be the question.
How did we get here, though? Because that's certainly, I feel like what everything you said is such an accurate analysis of the current situation that the EU finds itself in. And what it sounds like you're saying is that the US is using this moment, this Ukraine crisis, this Ukraine conflict, to deindustrialize Europe. Well, how did we get here? Why would the United States want to do that? All we hear in the corporate media, mainstream media, is that, as you said it, is that the EU is aligned with the United States, NATO is so together. There's never been a moment where we've been so together, and it's all because of, well, Russia is the reason they're all uniting supposedly. But that, I mean, this feels like an economic war on Europe. So,
Yes.
and you said it was such a thing. So, how did we get here? Why is the United States doing such a thing?
Well, everything the United States does has to be put in another larger frame, which my book with Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, as well as the previous book, Geopolitical Economy, has emphasized all along. And the best way of putting it is roughly like this. You may have heard people say that the United States is hegemonic. You may have heard other people say that the United States was once hegemonic but is now declining. But you've probably never heard anybody say that the United States was never hegemonic. But that has always been my argument. Part of the reason why this is obscured is that, of course, everybody, and the word US hegemony just slips so glibly and smoothly off people's lips. And there is no doubt that the United States has played a disproportionate role in the world, in the 20th century and 21st century history, simply, and it has been a big role, but it has been a primarily destructive role, because it is incapable of playing a constructive role. To be truly hegemonic, you have to be a leader, you have to inspire, you have to get people to, entice people to follow you rather than drumbeat them into following you, which is all the United States has been capable of doing. So the US has never been hegemonic, but even then, so it was powerful enough to try, but not powerful enough to succeed. But even what power it had is now declining. And so everything the US does has to be placed in this context today, as, and this is another theme of my book, as the leading neoliberal financialized capitalism in the world. It is productively among the weakest. Of course, the weakest is the United States, the United Kingdom, but productively among the major industrial economies, the United States is among productively this perhaps the second weakest. And so, as a consequence, its ability to actually do anything to stall that decline is also stymied. But at the same time, in order to create and maintain its financial or dollar hegemony, it has engaged in precisely the financialization, all the financializations that have in fact strangulated its productive economy, created profound economic inequality, etc. So so basically, I see the United States as desperately trying to maintain dollar hegemony and its own ability to control things in the world. This is challenged, and the more it is reduced, this ability is reduced, the more desperately the United States tries. So that's the conundrum it's in. Now, how did we get here? Why is the United States doing what it's doing? Well, for two reasons. Number one, European superior productive capacity, of course, represents a challenge to the United States, particularly as the United States would like to remain leader in leading technologies. And just as China makes, Chinese technological prowess makes the United States uncomfortable, so does European. And so, in that sense, it's not like the Europe has been successfully subordinated. Europe is seeking its own technological prowess, its own technological leadership, and this would be a challenge to the United States. So that's certainly one reason. But perhaps the even bigger reason is that in this, in retaining a bigger industrial base, in trying to create and maintain technological leadership, etc., the European countries and Japan, for that matter, have been expanding their economic relations with Russia, of course, for cheap energy, but most importantly with China. And the United States does not wish this increasing closeness to occur. And which is the United, so Russia is sort of the first step, but we are also hearing the increasingly louder drumbeats of war with China, just as this is not how it really is, but certainly this is how the United States would like to see it. Just as the United States is waging a war against Russia over Ukraine, so it proposes to wage war against China over Taiwan. So these drumbeats are increasing. And of course, since 2020, we've also had essentially a new Cold War against China. cross arena aggression on trade, on technology, and what have you. So human rights, etc., etc. So that's what the United States is doing, because China is emerging as the principal country that threatens American leadership, because China's economy is basically on the point of overtaking the US economy, even in nominal terms, let alone in purchasing power parity terms. And also, China's technological prowess is such that other countries would like to collaborate with it rather than the aging technology of the United States. And finally, and equally importantly, China's offer to the rest of the world, which is not imperial, which is friendly, which is based on mutual benefit, mutual cooperation. China's offer in terms of trade, technology, etc., is so much more attractive, because China is offering genuine gains without requiring imperial subordination. And, people may have thought that, third world countries were just, pacified by the United States, pacifically subordinated by the United States. That has simply not been true. They have always chafed at this subordination. And you know what? Now they have an alternative, and they are increasingly taking these alternatives. So the United States is in a very unhappy position, and the consequences we see in Europe and elsewhere are the results of that.
Yeah, yeah, indeed, indeed. I mean, yeah, there's so much in what you just laid out for us. And when you said that the United States and the UK are some of the least productive of, I guess you could say, the big capitalists, the big monopoly capitalist societies, nations, Western countries in this thing called the collective West. The IMF and the World Bank have both come out with really gloomy forecasts for 2023. Not just the World Bank and IMF either. It's also all of the biggest banks and financial institutions are saying the United States in particular is not going to achieve even 1% growth in GDP in this coming year, year on year. And I wanted to ask you, from the perspective of your book, what explains this slow growth? Because you outline that there is this slow growth, there is this financialization, there is this decline. But what exactly explains this? Because it feels like a lot of the actions taken by the United States, by NATO countries, with regard to Ukraine, for example, against Russia in this proxy war. You also mentioned China. It seems like they're connected, that this response to these two rising countries is seen as this existential threat. But that existential threat seemingly wouldn't exist if there wasn't pretty good reasons for it. I think sometimes we get caught up in the ideology, and there's a lot of the Cold War rhetoric and a lot of the xenophobia and Russophobia thrown about, but there's always a material basis to all of that. So I'm wondering what exactly is causing this slow growth that seems to be sparking a lot of concerns. And even the major financial institutions, if they were using their own definition for what a recession or economic crisis is, those kind of predictions basically say, yeah, there is a worldwide economic crisis happening right now.
No, this is a really $64 million question, because it goes to the really one of the absolute core arguments of the book. And in many ways, this argument represents a further refinement of the results I had achieved when I wrote Geopolitical Economy a decade ago. That was published in 2013, and Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War just came out in 2022. So late 2022, so almost 2023. So what's that argument? So I would say that, um, well, let's begin here. So when you had the growth slowdown in the 1970s, up until, practically most people we know something about this, that in the post Second World War period, Western economies were more generally speaking very different from what they have become today. How were they different? They were different in the following sense, that um, thanks to the disasters of what I call the 30 years crisis, the 30 years crisis of 1914 to 1945, which included two world wars, a Great Depression, and were bookended from the beginning and the end, bookended by the Russian Revolution, which was occurred in the first years of the 30 Years crisis, and the Chinese Revolution, which was essentially got going once again at the end of it, and of course the communists took power in 1949. So this was a really momentous period of time. Now, after all these disasters, which people forget, but practically everybody at the time blamed on capitalism, people thought that the whole world was going to go in a socialistic direction. But as it happened, the core capitalist countries, for reasons we can explore later, but the core capitalist countries remained capitalist, but not without an enormous amount of change in the form of borrowing from the socialist toolkits. So capitalist economies began to be have macroeconomic policies run for full employment. Financial and monetary policies also run in ways that aided investment, industry, etc., etc. These were the sorts of policies that powered the economic recoveries of Europe, of Japan, etc. Thirdly, they created huge welfare states. They instituted unemployment benefits, etc. So all of this was a way of essentially ringing around capitalism with a bunch of socialistic measures. And I would say that looking back on from the point of view of today, that they were the policies that made for the golden age of growth, the most sustained and most widespread period of growth known to the world economy and known in the capitalist parts of the world. Now, when nevertheless the underlying capitalist character of these economies eventually ran them aground, created the growth slowdown of the 1970s, which was also an investment slowdown, a crisis of high unemployment, a crisis of high inflation, a whole cocktail of things. It was called stagflation at that time. When that crisis came along, the West stood at a crossroads. It could have said, the reason for our prosperity in the last many decades and our stability and so on has been these socialistic measures that we adopted, and we should deepen them. We should go further down the socialist road. And we should also invest in the development of the third world, because one of the big problems at the time was that existing markets were saturated. So, where was the additional demand for additional growth going to come from? And that would have come if the West had invested in the development of the third world, that would have come from there. But the West did not choose to deepen those socialistic measures, which would have gone along with investment in third world countries and so on. Instead, it adopted a position where it looked back on the previous decades and said the real problem are these socialistic measures. Let's remove them. Let's free capital from the burden of regulation and taxation and all these socialistic measures and so on and so forth. Basically, state and social obligation. So let's free capital. The problem with that was that, and neoliberalism always uses the language of competition, that competition is going to promote development and restore growth and vigor and so on. The fact of the matter is that capitalist economies had stopped being competitive, had passed, had finished their competitive phase already by the early 20th century. Already by then, they had essentially become monopoly capitalist societies. So monopoly capitalism was not going to respond to these freedoms by restoring competition and the vigors of competition and productive dynamism and so on. It was just going to abuse these freedoms. So neoliberalism was applied, and that it was justified as going that by saying that neoliberalism was going to restore capitalism's productive vigor, but it failed to do so. It never did so, and it could not have done so for reasons that I explained. There are many sided reasons, but I explain in the book more fully. Instead, what you saw was an explosion of financial activity, which is essentially rentier activity. Financial activity produces nothing. All it does is it sucks income away from people who are actually earning and making value and earning income. So workers, even smaller business people and so on. So all productive enterprises lose. So and typically when investment is low, what happens is when productive investment is low, people seek financial investment as a way out. But of course, the result of that is to further compound the problem, because the bigger finance grows, the more it further strangulates production. So we have been in this spiral of increasing financialization, increasing productivity for now 4 decades. So looking back from the point of view of and what it's also showing us is that today, at this stage of the development of capitalism, if you give capital the freedoms it wants, it's only going to abuse them in this rentier fashion, in this unproductive, speculative, predatory fashion, right? So, what is the solution then? Is you must regulate it, you must impose obligations on it, you must force capital and capitalists to you must essentially control them in such a way that their activity is results in greater public welfare and greater public good. The problem with that that is the slippery slope to socialism. So the thing about what neoliberalism has done, neoliberalism has not delivered growth. The only reason why we keep it in place, why our leaders insist on keeping it in place, and by leaders, I mean former social democratic parties, former left parties as well. So, for example, right now, Keir Starmer, the leader of the British Conservative Party, is responding to a unimaginable crisis of the National Health Service by saying the solution is not spending our way out of it. I mean, if after 4 decades of cuts, if the solution does not include spending your way out of it, you are not going to solve the problem of the National Health Service. But you keep hearing the same mantras because the point is capital may not be beneficial, but it has to remain in power. And that is the function of neoliberalism. And that is why the leading neoliberal financialized economies are productively the weakest. And in the case of the United Kingdom, this weakness has been ongoing, that has been progressing for about 150 years, give or take a reversal or two here or there, for 150 years.
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean that's all critical history that you outlined there, and you know this, this situation that we're in, this it seems like this multifaceted crisis has, I think, pretty big consequences. And this book is about geopolitical economy. And so one of the things that you mentioned was this, rising Russia, China, that there was this assumption after the Soviet Union fell, especially, and even leading into that, that there was not going to be any other development model that exists. It would be just the United States's financialized, monopoly dominated economy. This neoliberal model would be it. Like that was it. And then, of course, the neocon foreign policy agenda is so connected to neoliberal economics. They became the most prominent force in foreign policy and in war making. And given that, I'm wondering what your thoughts are and how you understand now this very, what seems to be aggressive posture, almost in this fear base. There's a lot of fear and anxiety based, I think, war propaganda that we see just everywhere with Russia, with China. I mean, this Ukraine crisis, right? I don't know if there is a moment in history that we can cite where there is something more distorted and misunderstood than this situation. But of course, there are many that are on the same level or just there. So, how do you understand now, given all that history you outlined, what is what is the end game for this growing? You call it pluripolarity. Some of us call this, so a lot of others call it multipolarity, and I guess more mainstream literature. But it, there is these alternative models rising. There are countries that are saying, no, we are not going to be dictated by one or a handful of countries and this broader neoliberal economic system. Where do you see this heading now, given that this is something that I think we're going to be experiencing for quite some time?
Yeah, so first of all, to just very briefly answer your last question, where is all this going? Nowhere good. I think that if the United States, if neither external forces nor domestic forces stop US elites from taking this path that they have taken for, as you rightly point out, at least for 3 decades, if not longer. In fact, I would say through most of the neoliberal period, there was a point in time back when Carter was president where he, for a moment, when he gave his malaise speech, he delivered some sense, he conveyed some sense of a realistic assessment of the United States parlor situation. But of course, Reagan poo pooed him and won the subsequent election and so on. So we have been there for at least since then. So where are we going nowhere unless the United States is stopped by external forces, or there is such a radical change in government that effectively amounting to a revolution. I would say that the United States is going to continue on this path. And the reason, that you also mentioned the neocons. So let me maybe just start there, because you actually mentioned a lot of things that I want to comment on. But let me just start with the neocons and proceed from there. So basically, you get the neocon formation basically gets going already in the 1970s. Okay, they essentially what's happening in the 1970s is that a a lot of people who may have once been with the Democratic Party feel that it has been overtaken by peaceniks and, people who are sympathetic to Palestine and so on and so forth. So they essentially, historically, the Democratic Party has always been the United States war party, especially after Truman. And the Eisenhower was less of a he also made this speech about the military industrial complex and so on, so they were less so. Anyway, so they migrated from the Democratic Party towards the Reagan Republican Party. They were part of the Reagan Republican Revolution. And then by the 90 and but at the same time, when Reagan became president, the United States economy was quite embattled. I think very few people remember the first presidential contest in which Bill Clinton won. Bill Clinton won in part because there was a very successful third party candidate. Who was this third party candidate? It was Ross Perot. What did Ross Perot want? Ross Perot was saying to the United States, to the electorate of the United States, folks, we are in deep economic doo doo. We've got to do something about it. Japan is out competing us. In order to meet the challenge of Japan, we have to turn away from this crazy neoliberalism. We have to adopt Japanese style industrial policy. We have to adopt the sorts of economic policies that has made Japan an industrial powerhouse. Otherwise, our industry will continue to decline. This was the message, and a lot of people were listening to it, which is why they moved away from, of course, he was a conservative. So the biggest loss was to the Republicans. But still, that was a context in which Clinton won. And even Clinton had to promise a lot of economic regeneration and significant modifications of the neoliberal policy in order to win. So already the United States was in very deep doo-doo. But by this time, then what happened was that, and I tell this story in various of my publications, but that Alan Greenspan essentially engineered the stock market bubble. And it looked for a while as though the United States economy was booming. It wasn't. It was undergoing, in fact, a certain amount of increase in investment, but most of which proved completely misdirected. So, in fact, the United States economy was not doing well, but nevertheless, there was an appearance. And in this context, the neocons launched the project of the new American century. They thought, oh, in the last years of the 20th century, the United States is backfiring on all cylinders, and we are going to have a second American century, and so on and so forth. As you know, after became very clear that the misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan were ending in quagmire around 2006, that website disappeared, and the neocons are still there. They are ensconced, and they are still driving American policy. Anyway, so and in order to put this in context, I like to add one other thing that I've been saying. The United States has been pursuing the aim, United States ruling circles have been pursuing the aim of making the United States as dominant in the world economy as Britain had been in the 19th century. But this is not possible. because when Britain industrialized first, so for a time it was bound to have an immense dominance, but it was a matter of time before other countries, including the United States, challenged Britain's industrial supremacy. By the time the United States started to attempt this, power was already widely dispersed. Productive power was widely dispersed in the world economy. Um, and so I say that, circa 1870, when these challenges became manifest and everybody could see what was happening, that is really the first multipolar moment. The world was already multipolar back then. So, anyway, the thing is that the United States, however, has sought to pursue this aim, this ambition of what's often called hegemony, by which they mean essentially making, uniting the world under US leadership, etc., and making the dollar the world's money. They have never succeeded. Remember that by the time the 30 years crisis ended, the world already had two powerful communist states in it. In what way was it going to? It was already bipolar, and in fact multipolar as well. So anyway, so the United States has it somewhere deep inside its state structures, this impulse, and its ruling circles, this impulse to try to achieve this aim, and it has a long history of failing. So if it's such a long history, you might as well try some more, even no matter how low your capacities are getting. You can still try, you can do it through proxies, etc., etc.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think this is a good segue into a question that a Patreon subscriber has, and now this is a new feature. I'm going to ask at least one or a few questions from Patreon subscribers, so you can subscribe in the link in the description. YouTube members as well, you can join here on the channel. But there was one that I thought was a good segue into everything that you just said, and it's a hypothetical that I don't, that I think in this person goes by CCP Dragon Edge, a great name. And they wanted to ask, and I think that this is very relevant here, and something that I think a lot of people ponder, but don't necessarily ask this question. And they wanted to know that, this, what you're describing, this kind of imperialism, this empire, they wanted to know, since that it seems like the military industrial complex, that there is this huge transfer of wealth that is involved in all of this, what you described. And if it's all about the money, why couldn't why couldn't they get, let's say, all of what they get from this 800 billion military budget, for example? The US just passed, it's like 858 billion US dollars. Why can't that coexist? They're saying that why can't they still get their money, right? And at the same time build, let's say, why can't that production for like weapons and war to Ukraine, why can't that be diverted to, let's say, building homes for people in the US, in Canada, even given that Canada is so close to the US, and in EU countries that this is a big problem there as well? Why is it that there's this dichotomy between war spending, this increasing investment in war, and disinvestment from everything else? Why can't the two exist at the same time? And I think that's where sometimes you hear people say, well, why all this money for war? Why can't it be redirected? Well, why not? Why is it directed in
Why
this
does
way?
it need redirection? Why can't we have everything at the same time?
Yeah,
Is
why can't it all exist
what
at the same time?
CCP Dragon Edge is
I
asking.
think it's a good question. I think it's a question.
Sure.
I think they're definitely probably hitting at something they've either thought about or have heard others kind
Yeah.
of maybe tacitly endorse.
Right. So I would say, this is a very good question. And I would say that the answer goes to the heart of the problems with capitalism. So let me just begin anywhere. So, first of all, this doesn't happen because the people who are, people who run the military industrial complex, the people who own the Raytheons and so on of this world, they are extremely powerful, much more so than the lobbies that ask for greater house building or or what have you. So that's the first point I should make. And they, by the way, are more powerful because once something is a defense contract, basically the government or the generally the authorities, you are and the public for that matter, are trained to look away from how much it's costing. Because one of the greatest, I should say, it would be comic if it were not so tragic in terms of its consequences for the world. But one of the things we are discovering is that the United States, which we are always told spends this astronomical amount of money on its military industrial complex, which leads you to think that they must have the finest weapons in the world. After all these great minds and scientists are working on weapons. And the fact of the matter is that today, as far as the leading edge weapons are concerned, Russia and even China have actually got higher technological weapons, and American weapons are actually no match for them. So essentially, what we are looking at is that the military industrial complex itself is a giant boondoggle. And that is where, you make vastly cost plus profits because nobody looks at cost. You can always justify giving more money to defense. Um, so that's one part of it. The second part of it is that uh, the question is, you can all, I mean, there is a lot of say for example house building or medical services, etc., that big companies are willing to provide at a high cost. The question is the state going to buy it? And basically, so at some level, all of this overpriced stuff, whether it is weapons or houses or medical services, etc., theoretically the state could pay for it all. But, and this is where modern monetary theory is not right, where's the money going to come from? There is not a magical money tree. The fact of the matter is, we know that when the United States just prints money, the value of the dollar does go down. So, then the United States has to scramble to do something else to counteract, which is another thing we could talk about. But you have to essentially do something else to counteract it. So, for example, if the MMT theorists, which just last year were hitting the headlines with Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth, etc., I mean, don't you think that President Biden would dearly love to both spend lots of money on the war and consolidate his Democratic support base by doing a lot of social spending? But he can't. Even the puny bills that he did manage to pass in the first and second years of his presidency, and he certainly would have wanted them to be more generous, but they were puny themselves, and they had to be accompanied by measures of taxation. Because you have to tax. You cannot simply print money, because if you do, other countries will simply say, we don't want your inflationary currency. So, and they will not be accepting it. And remember that the dollars, shall we say, reach is also narrowing. A whole bunch of things are happening around the world precisely for this reason. So my point is, and then there is a third point, which is that essentially, and this is where you get into the nature of a capitalist state. A capitalist state must run the labor market and therefore run the government, and have an attitude towards the vast majority of people who are workers after all, which is such as to impose a certain level of discipline on them, that they must be, they cannot have everything easy. I mean, if the if our governments were in fact functioning to give us the best housing, the best house care, the best child care, the best education, etc., we would be living in a socialist paradise. But we don't. So the high cost of housing, etc., and remember also that when you have high housing costs, etc., some people are making a lot of money out of it. Part of the chief reason why we have high housing costs right now is all the housing speculation that is permitted by a highly financialized economy. So really, um, and so finally, you can't have everything, I would say, to CCP Dragon Age, because we live in a capitalist economy in which moreover presides over a less and less productive capitalism. So it is not capable of providing these things. And then if you say, well, let's have state agencies to build the social housing, to build the road networks, to provide the healthcare, of course, capital will be up in arms, because the moment you create that level of public provision, naturally people will say, why do we put up with these capitalists? Let's abolish them. We can have what we want by creating it as a public good. If we can do that, then we can, what is the use value of a capitalist? Marxists will ask. So,
Right. It's the threat of a good example. Or, I like to think of austerity and neoliberal economics as, in large part, and apologies for the sirens, it is an alarming situation indeed. But
Yes.
I think that I like to think about it as the reason why expectations have to be kept so low is not just because the model of capital accumulation means more for a few and less for the majority, less and less for the laboring classes. But it also has to do with the fact that if at a certain stage there is socialization, nationalization of certain productive forces and certain aspects and elements and and heights of the economy, what Lenin used to call the commanding heights of the economy. If that were to occur and continue and maybe expand, then yes, indeed, there would be maybe more and more expectations from more and more people to have a more socialized economy, potentially a socialist economy, one that is not dictated by, a handful of companies, monopolies, and corporations. And so, I wanted to ask to follow up on this too, and maybe we can start to talk about de-dollarization as our final topic in the conversation portion of this. I wanted to get your thoughts on this, given the question that we were just asked, and it has to do with, you know, it feels like neoliberalism, or it seems like neoliberalism. A lot of it has to do with the fact that capital itself does not want to invest capital. It feels like any kind of new investment has externalities, mainly a possible decline or decrease in profitability, that prevents it, right? You hear it all the time when they talk about China's high-speed rail, right? Or Russia's energy industry, right? It's like those things are nationalized and they're seen as pariah. And you even hear some of the major economic thinkers and economists say, well, that's not making money. That's just accumulating government debt. It's just more and more debt for governments. Why would we take on more debt? Yet the contradiction seems to be, well, all these corporations are operating on huge debt at this point. The financialization of capitalism leads to massive debt on the private sector end and huge amounts of debt, to the point where production can't even happen without taking out immense amount of debt. Hence why a lot of corporations don't want to invest in newer and more and take certain risks. They want to make more off of their collateral, off of the financialization that they're taking part in. So, could you? What are your thoughts on this, and how is it related to this dollar question? Because it seems like the U.S. dollar has a lot to do not just with capital investment, but also with geopolitics. Because one of the things that's happening is more and more countries are saying, this dollar system, this dollar, the petrodollar, Saudi Arabia, the United States, with this special relationship that's had worldwide implications. Even Saudi Arabia is saying, well, maybe I need to diversify how we're doing investments. Maybe Chinese investment needs to come with Chinese currency if we're going to if we're going to move forward economically. Seems like a lot of countries are doing this, joining the BRICS, for example. So what is your reaction to all of that? And how, and maybe how can your book help us understand this phenomenon
Sure.
in its totality?
Yeah, I mean, so there's really two questions here. One is, what's with investment? Why don't companies invest? Is it because they get indebted and so on and so forth? And then the second question is, what does all this have to do with de-dollarization? So let me take them in turn. So first of all, let me say that, in tandem with rising financialization, which at least until at least well into the 80s and 90s, that went hand in hand with relatively quite high interest rates. Interest rates have been rising recently, but they are not at those levels yet, and we can go into that in a minute, because of course the ease the financialization of the 80s and 90s based on high interest rates was of a different nature from what we have seen more recently. More recently, based on relatively low interest rates until this past year, we have had even greater amounts of financialization. But anyway, let me come back to the investment question. So basically, in these periods, most US corporations became quite self-financing, in the sense that instead of taking on debt, if they wanted to invest productively, they could simply invest their profits, because they did not want to get into high interest rate debt, etc. So essentially what I'm saying is that you already back then in the 80s and 90s were beginning to see the lineaments of a financial sector that was not aimed at facilitating productive investment, but was doing other things, was engaged in speculation, was engaged in various forms of predatory lending, and so on. We also, that as a consequence, got a vast explosion in consumer lending. I remember in the 80s, when you would get credit card companies writing to you. People would have credit card companies writing to people who were unemployed, offering them credit cards. Okay, so this while this was happening, actually the financial system in countries like the United States was abdicating its, what is regarded, when you take economics 101, you are told that the chief function of the financial sector is to provide money for productive investment, but it was already abdicating on this chief function. Instead, as I say, so corporations had already become self-financing, but even then they don't invest. Why don't they invest? Because of the demand constraint. When you, after 40 years of neoliberalism, which has kept the wages of working people in the first world countries quite stagnant, essentially not rising with, even though inflation was relatively low in most of this time, it was still, in real terms, wages were stagnant, which is quite something. And secondly, of course, the punishment that has been imposed by the West on third world countries, which meant destroying their capacity to consume, right? Because the incomes of third world countries were going down, they were very adversely affected. So with these two things going on, you cannot have an expansion of demand. If there is no expansion of demand, any capitalist would be daft to invest. Why would you invest? There is not any call for it. So as a consequence, in fact, I don't know whether people remember, whether our audience will remember, but the fact is that when the throughout the 2010s, we had leading central bankers, including Mark Carney, who was the Canadian central banker, then went on to become the governor of the Bank of England, which is the British central bank, and many others were pointing out that corporations in all the major countries are sitting on trillions of dollars of cash, which they are not investing. That is to say, they're not investing productively. What are they doing with it? They are investing in the huge opportunities for speculative, predatory forms of profit that was created by the deregulation of the financial sector. And so that where investment is concerned, I think the real problem is demand. So we don't have demand, partly directly as a result of neoliberalism. You cannot expand demand. If you cannot expand demand, investor expectations will not be very high, and they are not going to invest. Okay. And of course, if you expand demand, then you will have an empowered working class, which is also what you don't want. So capitalism is sort of really hemmed in terms of its choices if it wants to stay capitalist. Of course, if we simply want to expand our economy and expand it in green and sustainable ways, there is no dearth of possibilities, provided we consider public investment. This is the way to go, I would say, in most cases. And quite frankly, if people say, oh, that is too bureaucratic, etc., think about it. Most of the big corporations we're talking about, whose virtues we extol because they are somehow private, they are also big bureaucracies. They are nothing but giant apparatuses for planned production. So why shouldn't we create our own giant apparatus for planned production? So anyway, there's that. And then finally, you were asking about um, de-dollarization. So first of all, I would say that what looks like continuous dollar dominance in the world economy since circa 1945 is actually something quite different once you open the hood and look at how how it actually operates underneath, right? So basically, from about 45 to 71, the at Bretton Woods, basically by nixing all alternatives to the dollar, the American government essentially thrust the dollar upon the world and then tried to sweeten the pill by saying, "Oh, there, we will tie the dollar to gold." So we promised to exchange the dollar for gold at $35 an ounce. Now, even this arrangement fell apart more or less immediately in the following sense that, for the first decade or so, Europe and Japan were recovering. Their currencies were not convertible. And as a consequence, the dollar was the only international medium, and people sort of made what they could out of it, and so on. Um, but then, as soon as in 1958 European currencies became convertible overnight, the what had been a demand for more and more dollars turned into a dollar glut. Earlier, we were talking about scarce dollars. Now, unwanted dollars were flooding the market. Why? Because the Europeans did not want dollars. They had what they needed. In fact, they had by this time, better plant and equipment, better technology, better machinery than than the Americans had, because they had to create it anew. So you got the sort of the advantage that you get by coming later, so to speak. So that's what they had. They didn't want dollars anymore. And over time, between 1958 and 1961, instead of dollars, they demanded so much gold that essentially by 1961, the United States did not have enough gold to back the dollar with. And throughout the 1960s, what you saw was crisis piling on crisis about the dollar's convertibility, to which the Americans attempted every possible option. They said, okay, let's do this to patch up this, let's do that to patch up that. So there were a series of patch up arrangements, but even they came to an end. And by 1971, the United States, the Nixon administration said no more will be exchanged dollars for gold. Now, there was a time when this became an opportunity when the Europeans and many others thought, okay, this is the opportunity to install a really sane international monetary system rather than this insane one that the Americans imposed upon us in 1944, Bretton Woods, etc., etc. So there was a consultations in the Committee of 20, so-called, were going on, and but meantime, there was the OPEC countries decided to increase the price of gold, and what the Machiavellian Henry Kissinger managed to accomplish in all of this mess is he persuaded the OPEC countries to take the oil surpluses. Suddenly, they were sitting on vast oil surpluses, to take them and put them in Western financial institutions. Now, and this is, you have to remember that at this time there were again other competing proposals. All the oil importing countries, of whom Western Europe and Japan were, of course, in the front of the line, big industrial powerhouses needing energy, they had wanted the IMF to create a recycling facility in which the surpluses of the oil countries, they said, fine, you are welcome to, you have every right to raise the price of oil if it's your oil, but in order to enable us to buy it, could you please recycle your surpluses in loans to us so that we may be able to afford the oil, etc. But all of these plans were nixed, and instead, the this oil surpluses were deposited in dollar deposits. Oil remained denominated in oil. There was, etc. And this then in vastly began to increase financial activity, because if you're a bank and suddenly you are receiving millions, indeed billions of dollars of deposits, you may think you're all very happy. No, you are suddenly very worried, because in order to pay interest on these deposits, you have to earn it somewhere else. So the banks went on a lending spree, lending to who would borrow. And this gave rise to, as I say, an enormous financial tangle, so to speak, and which of course came a crashing with the Volcker shock, when Volcker, again, the Volcker shock was another example of how, you could not print money, that at some point, at least we can discuss inflation as a separate topic and another point, but I'm not endorsing what Volcker did. But what I am saying is that capitalist economies have only one way of dealing with inflation, and that is to use the sledgehammer of high interest rates. There are many other ways, but they lead away from capitalism. That's the key that you have to know for sure. So anyway, so then you have had, so essentially since 1971, my argument has been, and this is where, and Michael Hudson and I wrote a paper on this called Beyond the Dollar Creditocracy, in which we further elaborated this argument. Essentially, since 1971, the dollar has remained the world's money, chiefly because of vast dollar denominated financializations, which has enticed investors from all over the world, private investors mostly, to invest in dollar denominated assets. So nobody wants American goods, but they want American assets, financial assets. And that is how you have seen the dot-com bubble and then the housing and credit bubble. And today we have the everything bubble. Practically every asset market is awash with the money the Federal Reserve has created. Another story. But so the reason why countries are moving away from the dollar is that, for there are many reasons. The first is that it was always an imposed system which nobody was happy with, but now they are sufficiently unhappy that they are creating alternatives. And once some countries start creating alternatives, others see, hey, this can be done, why don't we do it? They do it. So it was always an imposed system. Also, it brought with it big costs. You could become involved, if you had your dollars in some or the other dollar denominated asset, and there was a crisis in that asset market, you could lose everything. This is not a very stable system. It is inherently, in fact, think of the numbers of financial crises we have seen in the last while. They are all, in some overwhelming majority, in some way or the other, connected with the dollar system. Thirdly, the appearance of China and an alternative source of long-term patient capital of the sort productive economies need, not the short-term capital that is provided by the dollar-denominated financial system. So there is that. There are a whole range of issues. Oh, and very importantly, there is the weaponization of the dollar system. We most recently saw a shocking instance of this weaponization when the United States effectively stole Russian reserves. Of course, they have also stolen Afghan reserves. We don't talk about them as much, and we should, because that is subjecting the Afghan population to starvation, to lack of medical access to medical care, and all those things. We bang on about human rights and democracy. If you cared about human rights, what about the simple right to life, the simple right to food in places like Afghanistan, simple right to medicine? Nobody thinks about that. But anyway, people have seen this, and this was only the sort of tip of the iceberg. A lot of other things have been going on underneath that policymakers do pay attention to. So these are all the reasons why the move away from the dollar will now be unstoppable. One final thing I'll say. The financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, it's often called the global financial crisis. And I'm personally terribly allergic to the term global anything, globalization, globalizing, global, etc. It was a North Atlantic financial crisis because, apart from American investors, the key investors, the region of the world whose investors invested most enthusiastically in the toxic securities generated by this crazy machine that the deregulation in the United States had created, were the Europeans, the British and the continental Europeans, and they got burned. But once they got burned, they have since reduced their exposure to the US financial system. As a consequence, what has actually happened is that, people talk about the expansion of the Federal Reserve balance sheet. And one of the key ways in which it must be understood is that the Federal Reserve is now supporting these asset markets, because without such support, they will crash. And there will also be a time when the Federal Reserve can no longer do this. So we may very well see a big coming crash in coming months or years, but maybe even months, I should say. Yes.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Radhika, it was really good to be with you today. I think you just provided a wealth of knowledge for our viewers here at the Left Lens. Before you go, though, and everyone do stick around, I do have one story I need to cover and some announcements. One announcement, though, before I let Radhika go, is that she and Michael Hudson will be back on this program February 2nd. So make sure you mark your calendars. I believe that will be sometime in the afternoon. So Michael Hudson and Radhika, who have collaborated quite extensively, will be here. So I am very excited for that. But do stick around, everyone. And Radhika, where can people find you? And one last, definitely plug the book. Everyone can find the book open access for free through Knowledge Unlatched in the link in the video description. But Radhika, take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, Danny. It's been a great conversation. I look forward to our other one in early February. And if anyone wishes to write to me, email me. My email is very easy to find. It's my first name dot last name and then at umanitoba dot ca. But if you can't find me, just Google Radhika Desai, um, political scientist, economist, whatever you want to do it, because there is apparently a cook with the same name. I'm not a chef though. So I do like cooking, but not as good as her, I'm sure. The point is that, so you am easy to find. I'd love to have your comments and reflections and questions, of course. And yeah, that's where you can find me. So thank you very much.
Great, great. Thanks so much, Radhika, and we will be in touch. Take care.
Yeah, bye bye.
Bye. All right, everyone. That was a great conversation, as always, with the great Radhika Desai. Definitely a huge masterclass there. Stick around, everyone. Do continue to stick around. I'm going to cover one story with all of you here. I've been a while since I've done an afternoon stream. But yeah, I've noticed there is still quite a decline in live viewership, unfortunately. So that's been a troubling development, one that I will be pondering over the coming days and weeks. But I do want to get a few announcements out before I move on to the story. And that is, so I may go live one more time before this, maybe Thursday. But one thing that is guaranteed is that this Friday mid-morning, about 11:30 a.m. Eastern time, Brian Berletic will be back on to do a military update, a conflict update on Ukraine. There's been a few developments, one of which I will cover here briefly. But he will get into a lot more extensive details on it. But he will be back on the program. And then in February, I am going to be doing a series of conversations. We are entering this 1 year period for the Ukraine crisis, for this special military operation conducted by Russia. And so I thought it would be a great time to get all those who have been basically investing all of their time in explaining and understanding it here on the program. So I'll have many different conversations. Michael Hudson and Radhika will do an economics of proxy war feature. I am trying to get a few others on as well to do that. And Brian will probably be on maybe later in that month, closer to the anniversary, hopefully, to follow up with our conversation this Friday. So we're hitting that 1 year point, and it's been quite a year. So there will be a series of conversations about Ukraine with many, many great guests. So you want to make sure you subscribe. Make sure you're hitting that notifications bell, of course. That is a great way to be notified sometimes, most of the times, hopefully, that when I go live and when I have posted a video. I also wanted to share with you my latest article, which I'm going to do in the chat. I might cover this either tomorrow or Thursday live, but the United States is already preparing for the next war, and it's with China. I posted this on my Substack, and I posted the link in the description. And Multipolarista was generous enough, Ben Norton. Well, I said Multipolarista. What am I saying? The Geopolitical Economy Report. That's going to take some getting used to. The Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben Norton was generous enough to repost it on there. I am a contributing editor to his publication as well, so I thought I would share it with his platform. And Black Agenda Report will publish it tomorrow. But you can find the link right now in the chat. Be sure to share that. Be sure to subscribe to my Substack. And that's another great way to support my work if you wanted to annually pledge on there. But of course, the last announcement before I get to the story is that, please do support this work at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong or Substack, or join this channel. I see a lot of channel members here, some of which are moderators. Thank you to all the moderators as well. Thank you so much for all those who already are. Um, who already are contributing. And I do have a few new features, one of which is questions for guests. So I'm going to be doing that for YouTube members and for Patreon subscribers. So if you do want to be able to ask questions of our guests, and I will make sure that guests are announced as soon as they're confirmed. So sometimes you'll have more time or less time to submit them, but nonetheless, if you do want to contribute to that, you can subscribe, and I will pick your questions to be asked to the very esteemed guests that I'm so grateful and lucky to have grace my channel. But with that said, I do have one other thing, a more remorseful announcement. Rockfin, there was some issues there technically today, so sorry to the Rockfin community. Rockfin did not get the stream up. I will post the video of this afterward on Rockfin for those who follow me there, rockfin.com/the left lens. I definitely want to make sure that this video is part of that community and accessible to that community. With that said, though, everyone, let's get to the story. All right. Um, so we'll cover this on Friday. But the story is that NATO is declaring, I think what this signifies is that NATO is declaring the Ukraine conflict, the Ukraine crisis, a permanent crisis, a permanent conflict. So there's already now announcements that, and when we've been hearing this day after day after day, that there's going to be more heavy weapons to Ukraine. Well, those heavy weapons are starting to be materialized, they're starting to be planned out. And so NATO has announced more heavy weapons to Ukraine. And I'm going to show you, after we cover a bit of the report, the Chinese perspective, because I think the Chinese perspective is the correct one here in what this will portend for the future of the conflict that is now entering its 1-year anniversary. So here are some of the details, though, of what NATO is doing. NATO is promising more heavy weapons. They have been for quite some time. I think Soledar, the loss of Soledar, definitely was kind of a wake-up call. But here you have the bloc's military leaders meeting in the coming days to drum up what these additional arms will be. And so Jens Stoltenberg said on Saturday, just a few days ago, that Ukraine would be receiving more heavy warfare equipment from the West in the near future. And the UK has already pledged tanks to the country, and Germany is under pressure to follow suit. A US-led contact group for arming Ukraine will meet on Friday. So they'll meet later this week. We are in a crucial phase of the war, Stoltenberg told Germany's Handelsblatt newspaper on Sunday after a day Ukraine lost a strategically important Donbass town of Soledar to Russian forces, which you may have heard from the Western corporate media is not that important, right? You've heard from the pundits. It's not that important, but obviously the way that they're responding, it's a bit more important than what they're letting on. So we are experiencing heavy fighting, said the NATO chief. It is therefore important that we equip Ukraine with weapons it needs to be able to win. So here is how NATO is talking. They're talking about winning. They're talking about continuing this conflict until victory. That is elusive. That is not possible. That's not going to happen. Ukraine can't win a war with Russia. They're already outgunned. They're outmanned now. That maybe wasn't the case in the beginning, given what Russia was willing to invest in this military operation. But now they are outmanned because of how long this has gone on and how many Ukrainian soldiers have been killed and sacrificed at the altar of the NATO agenda. So recent weeks have seen a dramatic escalation in the equipment promised to Ukraine by NATO's largest powers. The US, France, and Germany simultaneously announced at the beginning of the month. So that was the Bradley vehicles that we covered earlier in this channel, the infantry fighting vehicles to the military of Ukraine. And now the UK is confirming that they are going to send 14 Challenger 2 main battle tanks. The recent pledges for heavy warfare equipment are important, and I expect more in the near future, said Stoltenberg. Further weapons packages will likely be announced after the U.S.-led Defense Contact Group meets on Friday at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. This panel of nearly 50 countries has met 7 times already since Russia's military operation began last February, with each meeting followed by fresh pledges of military aid from America and its allies. So in the first meeting in May was followed by deliveries of anti-ship missiles from Denmark, helicopters from the Czech Republic, and artillery systems from Italy, Greece, Norway, and Poland. The group's last meeting in November came as the U.S. announced a $400 million aid package, including surface-to-air missiles. Although Stoltenberg insists that he does not want a full-blown war between NATO and Russia, Moscow has repeatedly warned that the West that its continued armed deliveries will only prolong the conflict in Ukraine while making the Western powers de facto participants. Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, has described the conflict as one between Russia and the entire Western military machine, but said on Saturday that the progress of Moscow's military operation is positive and the battlefield situation developing within the framework of the defense ministries and Joint Chiefs of Staff's plan. So there you have it. Delivery of Challenger 2 tanks from the UK, and there's going to be more to come. The United States is going to give more weapons, likely to Ukraine, via whether it's NATO countries, its own stockpiles. I doubt it'll be its own stockpiles. We will see. But obviously, there is cause for concern now from NATO, from the United States, that things aren't going so well. And I've said that so many times here. Things aren't going so well for NATO and Ukraine. The loss of Soledar was actually a big one. It wasn't a small thing. It wasn't something that should be underestimated. But over and over and over again, it has been underestimated, right? It has been, we have been told that it's not a big loss, even though it hits right at that defense line that Ukraine had drawn. It hits right in the heart of it. It hits right at critical transport infrastructure. And you know that this isn't it. It's not just Soledar falling. It's the fact that Ukraine is suffering massive losses in infrastructure, in electrical capacity. You have days and days worth of blackouts at any given moment due to Russian strikes. So a lot of this, I think, posturing and this escalation is about trying to fortify Ukraine and push it through, push it into conflict for a longer and longer period. I do not believe it's for victory. If the United States and NATO really wanted to achieve some kind of victory, they would have to confront Russia basically, essentially directly. They wouldn't be able to just go through Ukraine or use Ukraine as some kind of battleground, right, to fight Russia on the ground. But NATO doesn't want to do that because it's too costly. The United States doesn't want to do that for the same reasons. It wouldn't go anywhere except possibly a nuclear exchange. So they would rather continue to fight this by proxy and just step up the military arrangements. The problem with this, though, is that these military arrangements, and I look forward to talking to Brian Berletic about this, but every time I hear him speak, what he always emphasizes is that there's production, there's training, there's facilitating these transfers, and all of it takes time. And Ukraine, as Condoleezza Rice said in the Washington Post not too long ago, at the beginning of this month, time is not on Ukraine's side. Ukraine needs more fortifications. It needs to be stronger. Its military needs more help, and it needs to be done fast. The problem is that when you try to fight basically what is a conventional war, Russia's special military operation may not be an all-out war, but this is being fought in the trenches. It is being fought conventionally in many ways, with heavy armor, with artillery. There's been a lot of comparisons in the Western corporate media with like World War I, for example, that this is being fought in this conventional way. And nowhere in history, right? We haven't seen in history a small country, a proxy force, be able to defeat a large country, any small country, using these conventional means. It just doesn't happen. It belies reality. But the United States and NATO have, of course, other intentions, right? Their intentions are not winning a war. Winning a war is a propaganda point to essentially say, well, we want to continue profiting from this conflict. And even the European Union feels like this. How many times have we seen in the last several weeks, right? This past fall season leading into the new year, the EU has been complaining about the direction of this conflict, and we've covered that here. So this isn't some big secret. It really is well known that the United States has an agenda that doesn't include winning. This is a proxy war to try to weaken Russia. The real victory is in trying to bring down the Russian Federation. But that is a pipe dream. That is a fantasy. But here is what China had to say. The Global Times, which is considered, I think one of the best places to get the Chinese perspective, especially from the government, especially from the Communist Party of China and those who are in top leadership in China. And as you may know, Qin Gang, who was the U.S. The Chinese ambassador to the United States, is now the new foreign minister. But the experts that weigh in on this issue, the academics and the experts and the pundits in China, basically have concluded that this heavy weapons pledge to Ukraine is likely to drag all parties involved into what is a long-term deadlock, meaning a stagnant, continuous conflict that may lead to one side or the other making gains, but one where there can't be a conclusion or a negotiated settlement. And so, just broadly, of course, you could say, well, that's true, but there's more to this. And they get into this, and I think this is a very astute analysis. So, NATO has pledged heavy weapons deliveries from Western allies to Ukraine, while Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said on Sunday he expected more in the near future. Delivery of more weapons, heavy weapons, however, will only push Ukraine deeper into an abyss of a proxy war, making negotiations less and less likely, experts warned. At the same time, the parties involved in the war could be deadlocked in the long run. NATO's latest move came after Ukrainian forces have been strained on the front lines recently. So this is what the Western media will not admit. NATO likely also wants to use the move to show support for Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, said experts. In another recent sign that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is actually escalating, Russia and Belarus started a joint Air Force drill on Monday, which will last until February 1st, according to the Belarusian Security Council. Russian forces are embarking on a winter offensive of unprecedented scale and currently have the upper hand in terms of weaponry and morale, said Wang Xiaochan, an expert from the Institute of Russian, Eastern European, and Central Asian Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, told the Global Times on Monday. You will not find that anywhere in the Western mainstream press, that Russian morale is higher and that actually they have the advantage militarily. You won't hear that, even though it makes all the sense, right, that would be the case. But you won't hear it said once. It's always Russia's losing. I covered it in my article on the U.S. preparing for the next war. Even Foreign Policy Magazine, which is talking all of this high talk about escalating with China over Taiwan, they're still talking about Russia being defeated and how the biggest lessons we can learn from what's happening in Ukraine is that Russia wasn't as strong as they thought it was. That's how twisted and sociopathic this kind of neocon warmongering mentality is. There is no basis for reality. It does, no matter how stagnant this becomes, how much the line doesn't move, no matter how many Ukrainian troops die in small towns like Bakhmut, no matter how long that drags on and that Russian forces advance in a very methodical way without investing too many resources into it. No matter how much this is the case, they're always going to tell you that the opposite is true, that Russia is losing, that it's not advancing. So the joint Russian-Belarus exercise could be part of preparations for a Russia winter offensive to deter and hold back Ukrainian forces, thus easing the pressure on Russian forces fighting in the Donbass region. At this point, if the West does not provide more heavy weapons, such as main battle tanks, Ukraine will be at risk of a major defeat. But the delivery of heavy weapons also means the situation will not de-escalate anytime soon, said Kui Heng, an assistant research fellow at the Center for Russian Studies at East China Normal University, told the Global Times on Monday. NATO's attitude also brings the parties further and further away from the negotiating table, he said. Observers point out that the dragging out of this war is the main goal of the U.S.-led NATO. The U.S.-led Western strategy is to use Ukraine to drain as much of Russia's power as possible until it's dragged down, they believe. Thus, the intensity of NATO's military assistance to Ukraine depends mainly on Russian military pressure on the country. The U.S. has been restricting Ukraine's access to larger-scale weapons for a while, fearing that the move would anger Russia. However, when Russia commits more military power and is able to materially change the battlefield, Western military assistance to Ukraine increases. So nevertheless, there's a big question over NATO nations' ability to provide sustained weapons support, these observers noted. After a year of transfusions to Ukraine, it brought NATO's and even the U.S.'s weapons stockpile to low levels. France and Germany have the strongest military power in continental Europe, but they have consistently discounted military aid to Ukraine, although they have not explicitly refused it. So, France and Germany does not want to get involved, but they haven't refused it because it may come to that point where they need to. Ukraine has been caught up in a proxy war, and it will be further pushed into the abyss. When heavy weapons are funneled to positions in Ukraine, there is likely to be a long-term deadlock for all parties who are in fact involved in the war. So, there you have Chinese media saying it like it is, that this is a proxy war. One, that Russia has the advantage militarily and in terms of morale. Two, and that this agenda from the United States, from the US-led NATO apparatus, alliance, and of course, from all countries involved in this proxy war, the collective West, that their whole agenda is to prolong and prolong and prolong and prolong it. That it's not about winning, it's about prolonging this because of the disadvantages that their side is facing, that their proxy, Ukraine, is facing. And I think it's important to remember this fact. Remember that you don't hear any of this in the Western corporate media. You won't hear them utter disadvantages. You will hear them talk about, though, one thing you will hear them talk about is this problem of military armaments, of this problem of military resources. How much can they give? There's a lot of calculations going on about how exactly they're going to get this done. How are they going to maintain supply levels, support levels? How is this going to happen? That's why you have Joe Biden. You saw it. You saw Joe Biden to Congress with Zelensky next to him say, well, you're going to get 45 billion more in U.S. aid, in U.S. military aid, but don't expect getting more weaponry, more of the United States' own stockpiles to your forces that would potentially trigger a broader conflict with Russia. Don't expect that, because NATO doesn't want that. The United States doesn't want that. He said that right to Zelensky's face, and the disappointment must have been very palpable internally for Zelensky. But of course, there was a whole political theater moment going on, and so there couldn't be any indication outwardly. There couldn't be any outward indication of disunity. But and we've heard from Zaluzny, top general of Ukraine, Reznikov, the foreign minister, we've heard over and over and over again from Ukraine's side that they want more, need more, and will indeed demand more and more and more if they are going to make any kind of offensive happen. But how many months has it been since there's been any kind of Ukraine offensive, right? I remember, what was it, months ago? It feels like almost half a year ago that we were talking about Kherson and the offensives that were happening that Ukraine's military was waging. And since then, it's been crickets. There hasn't been anything going on. It's been many months of stagnant fighting where Russia indeed is making the advances when there are advances, and that Russia is still being very methodical about how many troops it sends out to the front lines. It's being methodical about how it's using its own weaponry, and it is taking part in a buildup of military production. And the United States and NATO, no matter how much they talk about doing the same thing, there are questions, there are costs, there are considerations that this all takes time. And a lot of that has to do, I think, because the United States is run by a military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex dominates the military apparatus of the United States and of NATO as well. And so when you're depending on huge monopolies to essentially ditch a just-in-time model, ditch a very profitable model of making what is necessary and pocketing massive profits just from what is deemed to be necessary in your stockpiles, and ask them to do more, well, then that means laying down more capital, building new production facilities, maybe expanding existing ones. And that takes money, and that also takes time. And it seems like time isn't on Ukraine's side right now. So what is going to be the future of Ukraine for 2023? That's the big question now that we're heading into the real winter, where the ground is freezing, where there will be more possibilities to do heavy fighting in heavy weather conditions, right? That's really what this is all amounting to. And it seems like, given all the reports that we're hearing, not only Soledar falling to Russia, but also Bakhmut may be on its way to a similar outcome in the coming weeks. What will Ukraine do? What will the collective West do? What will the United States do? It seems like they're trying to both deflect from this situation, prolong it as much as they can, and perhaps move to the next war, which will be the subject of another stream for another time. But nonetheless, that seems to be the direction of things. Moving on to the next thing, moving on, but also keeping enough eggs in this basket to pursue the agenda. Because no matter how bad it may be, the United States and NATO, the only thing they're losing is credibility, maybe weapons and resources. They're not losing much else. And so they're okay with sacrificing Ukrainian lives, Ukrainian troops, Ukraine's economy. That's okay, as long as it pays dividend for themselves in some manner, in some area. It will pay dividend for military contractor stocks. It will pay dividends in establishing Ukraine as at least a semi-NATO protector. It already has succeeded in that in many ways. And so it's willing to cut its losses as well as its gains and continue moving forward and maybe pursuing the next war, which I believe and which I assert is with China. So I just wanted to cover that quickly for you all, because I think it's I think it's important to give that report. There's a lot coming up, a lot to come around this question, around so many more. And so I hope to cover that as things develop. Now, Friday, there will be Brian Berletic on this channel, 11:30 a.m. So definitely save the date. Perhaps I'll be on Thursday. I was thinking about maybe tomorrow, but it may not be in the cards tomorrow. Tomorrow's kind of a hectic day. So possibly Thursday later in the evening. And I'll make sure you're all notified for that. But nonetheless, I did, want to just give one last plug to the Patreon. Okay. So there was a Patreon question. I'll have to save that for I'm going to save that one for the Michael Hudson stream. There's a new feature on Patreon. So for those who want to support this work, who also want to know how they can kind of benefit from that, one of the new features is I'm doing now questions for guests for all tiers. So do sign up at patreon.com/DannyHaiFong, and I'll be asking, I'll have regular guests on the streams, and hopefully your question gets chosen. I can't guarantee if there's a lot of questions, but generally there aren't, and there's just maybe, hopefully there won't be too many to choose from, and yours will get chosen. So that's one way that you can support this work, is subscribing on Patreon, patreon.com/DannyHaiFong. There's also many other links in the description, both for subscribing annually on places like Substack. You can subscribe monthly here on YouTube, $5 a month to become a member. And there's many other one-time options in the link in the description. So with that said, everyone, those are the big announcements. That was the one story I wanted to cover to make sure that I am giving you the latest updates and what's happening in that situation. Of course, Brian Berletic will be here to really go over what that means militarily, I think, and will it turn the tide of the conflict? I'm sure he would say no. I'm of the belief that no, the conflict is not going to turn toward Ukraine, not one bit. But one thing, we're going to, I don't know if YouTube is limiting my streams now, or if it's just time of the day, or if it's just, I don't know what it is, but yeah, there has been a massive drop in viewership to the streams, everyone. It's just pretty something that I'm going to be investigating. I might do a poll, see if people are getting notified for these streams. on YouTube community. So we're gonna try to figure this out and experiment and continue going on, moving forward with this work. So with that said, everyone, it's been a good one. It's been a good one. Radhika was great. There has been, there has been a tweak in the algorithm indeed. David says getting notifications. Where moderator, thanks for all your work there. Yeah, I do think they tweaked it probably. I knew they were going to. I just, it's just hard to say how that affects things and how do you outsmart something that gets tweaked? You can't. Desert Mantis, who also is helping out as moderator, he gets notified in Patreon and Chronicles of Dhaiphong. Yes. So that's the way you can keep updated as well, because I make sure everyone knows, that something is going on as part of my support community. So, of course, well, David, you're here quite frequently, so of course I will acknowledge you. Thanks so much for your support. Jenny says hit and miss with notifications. Indeed it is. So yeah, no, we're going to keep going though, and try to figure some of this out. But Thursday possibly I'll be back. If not, I'll be back Friday mid-morning, and but I'm always posting clips as well, so you get those too. Not today, but possibly tomorrow and the next day. With that said, everyone, I'm gonna go. This was a great stream. Take good care. And and we will I'll be back very soon. I'll be back very soon this week. It was a little bit of a oh, this is a good idea. Jenny said make a second channel solely dedicated to informing us that the main channel is going live. I've heard that old channels have, one of the things in the algorithm is that old channels can get messed in the algorithm over time. So perhaps I will make a new one. Let's see how it goes. All right, everyone, take good care. Have a good rest of your afternoon, evening, morning, wherever it is you are. Have a good one, and I will see you very soon later this week. Bye-bye.